Okay, so last time, Lammy, we talked about early access, um, and we also mentioned briefly modding. So we're talking about player engagement on the whole and how making games is no longer just about here's a product, go and play it, and then in 18 months go and buy another one from us, and we'll just keep making them for you. Like television, like cinema, like most forms of entertainment, gaming has become a much more interesting dialogue based art form where it's this push and pull between the audience and the developer, to the point that developers become players and audiences and players become developers. And in modding, that is especially true. In the research I did for this episode, I discovered some interesting stuff. First of all, I thought, and this is again my ignorance, as a not just as a developer but as a gamer, um, in this world, the kind of the hiatus I took for a long time. I thought modding was relatively new in terms of how fashionable it was. I knew modding was always around. I know that modding was around in the 1990s when the Civilization games were coming out in the beginning. But I didn't realize that it was in 2002 that there was an article in Salon magazine where it said that mods are no longer a hobby, but the lifeblood of the industry. That was 20 years ago. So that was mind blowing. I didn't realize that this phenomenon had been so central to the gaming industry for so long. I know that you're not a modder yourself, and you don't often play mods. But how do you feel as a player that this affects your experience of playing?
Again, as we touched on last week, I'm really pro any of these new engagement ways between developer and player. I think that they all have a place and that there are good benefits from all of them. Modding probably the most of any of them. It's probably the least potentially corruptible engagement form, I think, between developer and player, just because it's really the player making their own fun, uh, hopefully with the buy-in from the developers. So we can talk about this later. Obviously, not all modding is done legally, or I guess with the approval of the original developer. But no, I think that it's a really positive thing for the industry as a whole. I mean, it's just more content. And I think having content developed by people who are passionate about something, I just don't see how I could ever say that on the whole that might be a negative thing. Like there are potentially negative aspects, but I think it's great. I have definitely engaged with content that originated in mods, and I'd love to tell you a story later about the example of modding that I'm most familiar with. But I don't. It's true that I don't search them out specifically, and I think it's just like there's a lot of content out there. It's just like anything else. I think of it as another product. If there is a particular mod that is supposed to be really really good, I might check it out, just like I would a particular game that is supposed to be really really good. I have used mods for things like Minecraft. So usually it's like quality of life mods that I've engaged with, although not excessively. It'll be like, okay, let's just make sure we're adding all the basic kind of mods that make our lives easier within this game. Um, so I would say it's great, right? You get people to create things that may or may not be helpful, and at the end of the day, the community decides how popular any mod is, and therefore how valuable anybody's contribution is. And the things that might be game breaking or change the intent of the game often won't be liked by the community if they're not actually adding value to the game.
I think we're both speaking on the positive side. I haven't played a lot of mods, but the ones that I have, and again, most of them have been with Paradox games. Hearts of Iron 4 has, I think, 20,000 mods that you can find. Most of them are either old, outdated, very minor tweaks or additions. Maybe even they don't even work that well. But there is a lot out there for people who have either made the game a little bit better with quality of life improvement, they've overhauled the game, or they've done a total conversion. They've taken Hearts of Iron 4, which is set in set in the Second World War, and they took it into the First World War. Or they've imagined, what if Germany won the First World War? What would the time period of the Second World War look like. And the amount of historical research and the work that has gone into this is a whole other game, right? The amount of time and the amount of love and passion that has been poured into this is essentially a development team coming up with a game just using the same engine as the other one. It's wonderful. And you can't expect a company like Paradox to produce the amount of content, a good content that is produced by the modding community. So it's a totally a positive thing. Sorry, not a, okay. Let me take that back. It's not necessarily totally a positive thing, but my experience with modding has been totally positive. Just the sheer amount of stuff I can do as a result of other people pouring their love into these games. Another one, it would be Neverwinter Nights, which was a D&D game from I think the early 2000s, following off of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, BioWare game, I believe, or at least in that ethos, that tradition, and it has become a game where people essentially create their own D&D campaigns in the game that you can now play, and there's hundreds of them, and it makes the game repeatable. This is an old game. This is decades old, and people can continue to play it. So it extends the livelihood and the lifeblood, again, using that word, of the game. But there is, I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment. And I don't want to spend this entire conversation playing devil's advocate because I don't think that's what either of us are trying to do. But I did have a couple questions about modding, just how it affects development and how it affects the player and the audience as well. So I'll take a bit of a tangent here and talk about Roblox. I don't know very much about Roblox, but from my understanding, it is a platform mostly for kids to create really simple games and have other ones play them. And you can even make a little tiny bit of money off of this when you do it. But essentially, Roblox is now a very big company, very successful, that has earned its profit off the backs of children doing labor, essentially for free. Now, that might not be how those kids are feeling, but sometimes it doesn't matter how someone is feeling if they're being marginalized, if they're being utilized, and if they're being, well, capitalized upon, if they're being used by a larger system, whether they're aware of it or not. I wonder sometimes if these larger game studios are making games to be modded and therefore being taken off the hook of doing a good job. There's a lot of games out there that aren't very good, but are made good by modding. Is that an acceptable standard to have in the gaming industry? We're talking about the moral issue of using children, right? But we're also talking about a more creative issue of what a gaming studio and what developers should be asked and tasked to do that's being done for them by the community. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I've never played Roblox, so probably going to be really ignorant when it comes to that particular topic. Um, but a few things came to mind when you talked about that. Really, what you're talking about sounds like the early days of YouTube, essentially a company making money off the backs of other people creating content. And
Yeah.
even to today, but okay, now they're actually paying people. But it took a long time before they had that as part of their model. And really it's what it is it's a crowdsourced model where the data, the content, whether, there's lots of other ways to crowdsource, including traffic data. Technically, Google makes money in some ways or another from the fact that we all use Google Maps and we are all spending our time bettering this platform. So I think this kind of economic standard already exists, not just in gaming. It exists, and I think it still has a place. I've always been very positive on crowdsourcing. But it's true that, unfortunately, in a capitalist world, you can have organizations taking advantage of people's desire to use community to do good, right? So in the same ways as with something like YouTube, where there are lots of very, very legitimate arguments and reasons that YouTube or other platforms like it aren't doing enough, maybe Roblox, to support their creators. Like when all of the value for this company is actually coming from other people doing the work, I do think there's a good conversation that needs to be had. But I think rather than say we shouldn't allow platforms like that to exist, I think it's more about regulating them potentially. And if there are games being made like this, I would go back to what you were kind of talking about, which is saying rather than thinking of them as a game, they're more of an engine. They're more of a game engine. They've developed a playground, a sandbox that people can build on, and maybe it itself isn't a game. And we come back to what is a game. It's a place to build in the same way that, yeah, is Lego itself um, the game, or is it tools that let you play your own games? So yeah, I mean, maybe it's a toy but not a game, right? We come back to that, and I think so. I don't think that I never, I really tend to stay away just in life in general from blaming the thing and saying the thing is bad or evil inherently. It's usually how people use it. And what that comes down to is regulation. And I'm pro most technology as a developer. And I think the way you fix it is through regulation, not through saying that that thing shouldn't exist and we should regulate the object out of existence, or, or the system itself. It's just figuring out if people are getting taken advantage of, how to prevent that, um, rather than saying, oh yeah, this is a bad game because all of its content actually comes from modders. And honestly, I don't know if there are many games where that's been the case, only because usually if it's only getting value from people creating content for it, it would have never have picked up off the ground to begin with. There's usually something interesting there for it to be considered a good game and to actually be used and modded, uh, in my experience.
Yeah, there's a quote. I think it's Shakespeare. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And I remember actually reading a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, and it's about essentially technology and how to live with technology. It's written in the 1970s, I think. Um, and I remember reading that book and realizing, oh, right. So technology is hard, it's difficult, it's challenging to deal with in our lives, whether it's screen time or the interconnectedness, social media, um, how this is affecting our politics, our social world, everything. But it's not the thing itself that is bad. It's how we're approaching it. It's our attitude towards it. It's how we allow ourselves to look at our phones 18,000 times in a single day. It's how we fall into it. Now, the fact that I'm looking at my phone so much throughout the day is not necessarily my fault. It's a very powerful company that has done a ton of research into finding out how exactly to manipulate me and hold and gather my attention as much as possible. So, to some extent, there is a an imbalance there. But in the end of the day, it's my life and it's my choice, and it's how I'm going to approach it. So I completely agree on that point, and I think that that's how we have to approach the problem. There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That the idea of yeah. Anyways, I don't want to go too far into that. But when it comes to modding, I don't want to spend too much more time on the devil's advocate side of it. But I did want to ask you, as a developer, obviously you're not a game developer, but you're a developer. If you had this kind of engagement from the community, not would it be bad, but how would it affect your work? Would it make it more enjoyable? Would it make it more interesting, or would it make it exhausting?
I don't know if I'd think exhausting. I think I would have to think long and hard about whether I'm way too much of a control freak and way too arrogant to ever want modders into my existence. Um, we've touched on this before as well, but this idea that we kind of respect and idolize these brilliant people who clearly created such an amazing game, from their own group of developers, whoever that might be, that they immediately knew everything that would be perfect, and therefore, somehow they're better than ones that had to iterate or learn, potentially help from modders to make their game better. Like, we have this idea that obviously the development team that just got it perfectly right the first time is better, and that not taking outside input sometimes can mean that you have a better product at the end of it. So I think I'm also like quite the control freak. So I think if I had a very clear vision of something that I wanted, I don't know whether I would welcome modding. I mean, I'm just from a moral standpoint, I would never really want to stop it, but it might just irk me that, I didn't have the great idea that somebody else had. So there might be some ego to get over. I don't think it would make it more difficult, though, from an actual development standpoint. I mean, as long as, again, they're separate. To me, they're separate products. Whatever I would have created as a developer is my product, and any mods are shouldn't reflect on me unless they're better. And then it's like, well, why didn't you make it like this to begin with? And I think, how could you say that that's something that, like, if it makes your life difficult, it's only your own fault. You didn't make the game better to begin with. That's something that I would welcome in the end. In other words, the criticism by modders, therefore making a better version, I would welcome, because it would probably make my next project better. Yeah, I don't think it's going to make it more difficult as a developer, because I would treat it very independent. I'd be doing my own thing. And if I ever did want, like, if there were particular modders and developers out there that I really enjoyed the work that they were doing, I might reach out to them to work with them, or something of that like. And I don't think that makes it harder. I think that just makes better products.
So along those lines, should modders be paid for their work?
I think it really depends. If it's a separate product and you want nothing to do with it, then no. Again, I mean, I think as long as that's a really complicated question. Again, we come back to is the value of the original product only good because of the mods? And I just feel like if the original developers didn't ask for it and the modders are just doing it, it's a bit of the, when you travel in other parts of the world and somebody hands you a flower and you take it and then they say, pay me. I don't know if you've had that happen, but I've traveled in a lot of countries where that's. Now, I come from one of those countries, so I never take the flower because I know what's going to happen. But it's a bit of that, and that feels icky, because it feels like, but I didn't ask for this help, and now you've done it, and you're requesting payment. I think that modders can ask for payment from the player who is choosing to play their mod. But from the original developer, I don't really see how that would work, unless, again, the developer said, I want to include your things in the main game, or I want to work with you on future. And then yeah, of course, it's just a regular employment contract.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. Steam, owned by Valve, back in 2015, released a feature for paid mods where you'd pay for certain mods. It
Yep.
didn't last long. There was a huge backlash and they discontinued the service. I'm not sure how long it was, but it wasn't very long that this feature was out there. But what they saw was this dilemma of the fact that most games have, and Steam's statistics show that most games' shelf life is about 12 to 18 months, which can be extended by mods for 3 years or more. Sometimes, as we've talked about, for decades. But usually it's around 3 or 4 years that a game will last if it's been well received in the modding community and people like playing those mods. But clearly, the community, at least the majority of the community, said, no, we don't want this to be a paid thing. We don't want to alter a good thing. We want to keep things the way that they are. But then we're getting into this area of, people who are doing work for a game that is now 3, 4, 5 or more years old that shouldn't be getting any more money. It's kind of like, I shouldn't be saying this on YouTube in public, but if a movie's 5 years old or younger, I'm going to buy it or I'm going to rent it. I'm going to go to a streaming service. If a movie's from like 1986, I don't mind watching it for free. I really don't. I haven't done this for a long time where I've gone and found a movie for free, but I don't see why a movie made that long ago should continue raking in money. They've had their splash, but the same thing, would I say the same thing is true for a novelist who was published in 1986 and I go to buy their book? Should they not receive any of the money for that book? It should all just go to the publisher now, or the person who's printing it. Does that make any sense? So I know I'm contradicting myself, but this question of at what point does the person who made this game continue to receive money for it, especially if the game is not even recognizable to its original state? Now, I'm not saying I have any solution for this. I just find it a really interesting, maybe even intractable problem that is worthy of conversation and goes to the center of what games are today and how games are made today. You mentioned earlier that you had an experience with a particular game and a particular mod of that game. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I think my favorite example of modding, which again, I have not actually engaged with, I hadn't played the mods because I love the original game so much, but I watched the modding community for it quite closely, is a little indie game called The Binding of Isaac, which I have brought up briefly before. But so it's a really important example for a lot of different things in the gaming world, because it was an indie game that revitalized roguelites and made them roguelites and roguelikes popular again. Literally single-handedly made that happen. It was also an example of a developer who didn't think that this game was going to take off at all and coded a very, very poor version in Flash to begin with as a sort of almost cathartic self-therapy of their own upbringing. And it took off so much that he then actually went, okay, let's make this for real, redeveloped it completely on a new engine and everything. And every time the developer worked on this, he was essentially like, I'm not, like, this is it, I'm not touching it again. And yet kept coming out with updates just over and over again, saying, nope, this is the last updates, but kept coming out with updates to the point where they were like, no, really, this is the final fourth, fifth, whatever version. I'm not coming up with an update. And modders who had been working now and modding this game for a long time, there was a particular group of modders who came up with such a dense and deep mod for this game that actually added new playable characters, new bosses, entire new environments and maps, new items, like just everything. That was so impressive that he actually changed his mind again and said, we're actually going to hire these developers and we're going to integrate their changes into now what is supposedly a final version of this game. But even prior to that change, one of the interesting things they did on one of their last DLCs ever was that they said that they would create free updates. So there was one DLC that was paid, but they said that that DLC would get free updates that would bring in mods periodically. So they would look at what was on the Steam Workshop, and anything that seemed pretty good, they would just every 3 months or so bundle it into a free update and add those mods in as part of the main game. And it was one of those mods that ended up being so massive that they actually had to rework and take like 3 years or something to actually create a brand new version that included all that work.
Wow.
And obviously those developers got paid. So when we talked about that, that's the example I was thinking of being a developer who worked on something and you kind of put it out there. People mod, people do what they do. And you go, wow, this thing is so good. These developers have great ideas, clearly are good at their work. People love their work. Let's work with them. Let's reach out. And it, I think, inspired the original developer further. So, and I say developer in this case, Edmund McMillan, who is the creator of The Binding of Isaac, he's not a developer. He's the creator. He'd be more like you and what you're trying to do. He's not a developer, but he created the game and is very deeply involved in how the game functions with everything except, you know, actual code is not really his his thing. But I'm using that word to kind of mean developer of the game, whether it's
Yeah, no, I get
or
you.
not.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, that's, I mean, that was an impressive run for a game to have. It definitely extended past that couple year or 1 year mark for a game. It kept growing and growing and growing. And it had ups and downs. There were updates in there. So we're talking about the goods and the bad. There were updates in there that made the game as a whole worse. They just added, even though it was just added functionality, it watered down the good parts because they added in so many parts that were only okay. It actually watered down the experiences of the really good portions. Now there was less of the really highly concentrated good moments in the game and a lot more just filler, it felt like. And they addressed that in the bigger final release by rebalancing everything. And it's, I think, one of the reasons it took so long too is that they had been adding all these mods, which added items, which then really ruined the kind of experience of playing the game in a normal way. And then they had to look at that and reevaluate and rebalance everything so that it felt right again. So there were ups and downs, but I think it was a very positive thing for the community, and it kept people engaged in this game for, I think, over like 10 years, I want to say, that it's been around now. I'd have to look at what year the original Flash Isaac came out.
It sounds like a chapter from game development period, or actually just any form of making art. You start on a path and you recognize almost immediately, if you're good, that the path is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. And the product is going to be something different than it was when you first envisioned it. Rarely do you have an idea, you execute, and that idea is exactly what you always thought it would be. Maybe Mozart is a good example of someone who had the music in his head and just had to write it down. You know, sometimes that works and it turns out to be a masterpiece, but usually we have to go on the journey of the piece of art. We have to let it take us somewhere. And what's to say that modders can't be the ones that grab our hand and take us down a path we didn't expect to make it better in the end? This is still a very interesting artistic question, because I remember in one of our first episodes, you and I talked about the economical nature of a game, and how if a game has features that people aren't really playing or aren't really enjoying, then those features are bad. They're not, and if only 5 people are playing it and loving it, and 80,000 people are not playing those features at all, then those features probably shouldn't be there. There needs to be a holistic approach to most games. But modding allows us to add features and ideas and make these vast canvases for games that you can, and that's of course the point. They're adding replayability. You know, to go back to the mods that are done to Paradox games. So Stellaris is another example. You can play Stellaris like 100 times and have a different experience based on the choices you make at the beginning. What origin does your empire have? What civics does it have? And what you're RPing in the game. A mod is another whole layer of replayability, to the point of ad infinitum. You can get thousands of hours playing this game and always have a slightly different experience. And so I love that aspect of it, but I think it's taking us into two different directions. There's the entertainment aspect of it, the replayability, but we talked about Doki Doki Literature Club. Is that, I don't know, is that a game that could be modded? Probably, I'm sure it has been a million times, but would you have the same visceral horror experience that was necessary for the original game? And if you're playing something that's modded, is that just something different? Is that still a good thing, but not what was intended, and not the necessary game that you and I talked about? And I think this is maybe not an interesting question for players because they just want more, but I think it is an interesting player for the artist, for the creator, to ask themselves about how this relationship works, and how games are developed. What am I trying to do here? Am I just trying to make it as big as I can, as many features as I can? It reminds me of that meme of the guy with the handkerchief sweating and the two buttons, and one of the buttons is release now and the other button is add another feature, and the constant decision of, do I just stop adding another thing to games, right? Because there's so much you could do and continue to do, again, ad infinitum. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say to that when you asked the question a few times today about whether people playing the modded version, if that counts as the experience that was originally intended by the developer. And I think that to me that's a question that doesn't matter, because again, as the player, they will have the choice. That's why I see them as separate products. There is the product
Yeah.
that the original developer made, and if that's good on its own and is perfect, that product should come out as one that people enjoy. If, for example, every single person like doesn't experience your game the way it was made because they read a million forum reviews that say, no, 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 you cannot play this without this quality of life mod, it's necessary, otherwise the game is frustrating, then maybe, yeah, that's where you go, okay, well, I guess I should have put that quality of life fix in myself. Or I think it would be very rare for these games that we're talking about, the ones that are really unique experiences, because they're usually story games. And so any mods to a story game that are still going to be thought of the community as necessary mods likely aren't going to change the story. They're going to just be other things that therefore I don't think would affect the gameplay that much, or the actual feeling. So I mean, if it's something that's changing the story, then yeah, that just means your game wasn't actually that good to begin with, or like the impact wouldn't have been in the original necessarily. at the end of the day, I've just always been a proponent for choice. I could think of examples like maybe there's a really, really traumatic or triggering story beat in one of these really intense games, and there's a mod that removes it for people who can't handle that. Like we're talking about Doki Doki. I could totally imagine a mod that leaves it to be playable, but maybe has slightly less triggering, you know, visuals or something. And I think that as long as the consumer makes that decision of what they want to engage with, that's their choice. They might have never played the game if that mod wasn't available.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like I'm always thinking about how this same conversation would go if we were talking about books or films, right? So if we were talking about that exactly that, let's take this book, but take out all the triggering parts, or take out all the parts that talk about Taiwan, so we can release it in China, for example. There, we could get into trouble here, and I think you're right. I think we're usually talking about different products. If something changes the nature of the game and the experience of playing it, it isn't just an improvement of how a controller works or what you see on the screen in front of you, just a basic improvement of quality of life, then we're talking about a different product, which should be treated as such and evaluated as such, and critical, and we should be critical to the same degree.
But there's also copyright issues. I'm only saying this with the developer's consent. So when it comes to books and even games, if the developer does not consent to mods, like if there's a copyright issue, and when we talk about concerns over censorship, I would say that is a like illegal way of changing and altering the original product. It's still art, it's still a creation. It has copyright. Code has copyright and patentability. Um, I think the developer is completely within their right to say that I am not okay with, the work being modded in this way.
Sure.
I don't know what the legality of that currently is, but I mean, I know that there are lots of games that cannot be legally modded, right? I mean, Steam is, and I actually don't know how that functions on Steam. I'm not sure if you do, if any game on Steam can be modded or if the game itself has some settings around whether it's subjecting itself to modders.
No, I read about this. There are certainly developers who are. It's not just about the legality; it's about enforcement. I mean,
Mhm.
legality is we talked about watching free movies a few minutes ago. That can be illegal all you want it to be, but unless you can enforce it, it doesn't really matter. And so, what a lot of developers are doing are creating tools to make their games unmoddable when they really want to, and to really kind of close them off. An interesting story right before we end off, I read about the hot coffee episode with Grand Theft Auto. Have you heard about this?
No.
So the Grand Theft Audio. This is Grand Theft Audio right now, but the Grand Theft Auto games, which are a whole conversation we could have another time. I've never actually played them before, but they really push the needle
Mhm.
on what games you're doing and how they're influencing people and what you're allowed to do and all that, and censorship. But there's one of the games, I don't remember which one, where there was hidden in the code an episode where you could have a sexual encounter with someone in the game and actually control the encounter and be in the rhythm of an encounter. It wasn't rape, but it was sex with a girl in some house or something like that. And and it's called hot coffee because she invites you, the player character, over for hot coffee. And this is what happens. It was never intended to be released. It's believed, I think, that the developers just made this as an inside joke amongst themselves, and they essentially pasted it over when the game is released. But of course, people found it, and someone released a mod where you could go in and play it. And the problem is I would love to have someone explain this to me who's a programmer. They couldn't take the content out of the game. They couldn't just delete it from the game. It was embedded somehow into the code of the game. And so people, even today, you can go onto YouTube and you can watch this scene. I'm sure someone has a mod out there, whether it's on Steam or not, where you could play hot coffee. But they got in a lot of trouble. They were sued because it was released for a larger audience, and of course this was explicit content, and so kids were playing this scene, and they got sued for that. And so now developers are very harsh with their people to not put Easter eggs for
Mhm.
themselves into games, where that used to be a very normal thing. Even in Disney movies, if you think of
Oh
Lion King,
yes.
right, when it was like the lion falls into the sand and
Mhm.
sex is spelled into the air, or in the Little Mermaid. I think one of the sailors on a boat has an erection or something like that. Which, as adults, this is pretty funny. I mean, come on, it's amusing. And we also get to see the inside of the development process. But the hot coffee incident had some big waves that continue to influence game design and development today. Anyways, uh, we're at time now. Lammy, what did we not talk about that you wish we had? I know you got to be ready for
Oh,
that question. We're always going to ask it.
yeah, I'm not so ready for it today. I think there were still some things. I mean, I don't know if we should talk about them next time. We didn't really get into. I did want to talk a little bit more about like the consent aspect of it and developers who aren't okay with modding
Mm,
or emulating. So maybe one thing we can talk about next time is emulators because it's a similar. It touches on similar topics, especially things like what you were talking about, which is trying to play or experience really old content and whether you should be paying for that, whether it should be accessible.
yeah.
So yeah, maybe let's talk about emulators.
Yeah, that would be great, actually. If it weren't for emulators, I would never have been able to play the whole game of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past because I don't have a Super Nintendo anymore. Okay, cool. That's great. Lammy, thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.